Okay. Channel 7. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Okay. Duda just says that it's being recorded and transmitted to the whole world. We're not from Pernambuco, but still. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to welcome Professor Marcelo Pinho and Professor KJ Joseph. Professor KJ will give the speech, and Professor Pinho will make his comments after that. Professor KJ is from the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum, the capital of Kerala in India, and has written several books, published many things, and is the editor-in-chief of this journal, Innovation and Development. And so, according to Duda's instructions, you have all the time you need to tell the story, the history of India, and make your comments.
Right.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. I like to speak from here. Good morning to all of you. Mic has some problem. Is it working? Yeah, it's working. Yeah. Professor Roberto Montemor, chair of the session. Professor Marcelo Pinho. Friends, I know it is always a pleasure to come back to your friends, even that too after 7 to 8 years. I've been to this place almost 8 years ago. We had some joint work. And totally unexpectedly, a few months ago, I received an email from Eduardo proposing an idea of a workshop. I readily agreed. I know if I don't agree, there will be many others to grab the opportunity. So I thought better I say immediately. But then later I realized that I do many mistakes. This is another mistake. So as professor, we always depend on your students. So I co-told of 2 of my PhDs. Another former PhD now currently working in UNSCAP. So I told, look, there is an opportunity like this. They wanted to talk about lock-ins, traps, and catch-ups. I know only one thing as professor. We are in the profession of professing paradoxes. So I must say some paradox. Otherwise, there is nothing interesting. So I thought, what is this? So we looked for what is called, any catch-up, any lock-in or traps. The most familiar thing that came to our mind was the so-called MIT. We found that India is not in the trap. So what else? So then we found that, we have been trying our level best from 1951 onwards to evolve an industrial power, to make India an industrial power and develop a sound manufacturing base. But the more policies, the more the number of committees that we appointed, There was no increase in the share of manufacturing, but the share was either remaining stagnant or declining. So then we thought what we are having is what is called a deindustrialization without industrialization, because our GDP never, our share of manufacturing never exceeded 15%. And we have our predecessors, both from the developing and developed world, which shown that industrialization is perhaps the only way to prosperity. And their share, for example, South Korea, their share was more than 30%, China more than 30%, but India never even achieved half of that. And even there, it is stagnating. So we wanted to kind of evolve a story around that. So this is what how I have titled the presentation, The Journey of India's Development Towards Deindustrialization Without Industrialization. So then came another challenge. Eduardo told that it has to be a detailed and, I'm not here to present two hypotheses, three regression, and go out of the room regretting after regressions. He wanted to kind of, inform the audience what's happening over there. So rather the conclusions are for you to say, my job is to say the story. Based on my story, I am asked to create an environment for you to think. And 1 hour is, the chairman is very free, and he told me that I can take any amount of time, provided I don't exceed 1 hour. That's what you said. Just like Ford, any color car is possible, provided it is black. So 1 hour is there. So what I'm going to talk about is to begin with what is called, I call it the journey. I mean, there's nothing like the journey. There are different journeys in India. The journey of India's industrial sector and science and technology development. Then tried to kind of send the message across saying that the outcome of the all initiatives during the last 70 years was something like the industrialization. And now, we being the innovation system scholars, at the end of the day, I'm trying to provide some kind of what is called some basic ingredients of an analytical framework, which perhaps could be one way to think through what India has experienced. So then by way of conclusion, I think that is, perhaps you may not allow me to conclude because you will, conclusions are not very important here anyway. My Prime Minister is not here, economic advisor is not here. Our prescriptions may not be taken very seriously. Okay, let us start the journey. This table is from Madison data. You will be surprised to know from this part of the world, in the year 1500 or in the year 1700, during the last 2 decades, almost 50% of the global GDP was contributed by 2 economies in Asia, China and India. And thereafter, we have the history of colonization, which different parts of the world were subjected to at varying degrees. And we find a steady decline in the share of India and China in the global GDP. And today we find this curve is showing an upward trend. Going by the nominal GDP, China has a share of over 15%. Professor Kunle has dealt at length with the consequence of that between, what the world is facing. And India's share is almost 3%, and in purchasing power parity, India's share is almost 7%. Now, let me be a little bit more precise, since our focus is more on industry and manufacturing. In 1750, India accounted for almost 21/4 of the manufacturing output of the world economy, and China's share was almost 33%. And as the time went, the share of by 1938, India's share declined by 1/10. It declined to 2.4%, and China's share also declined. And this process has been subjected to substantial inquiry at the hands of historians. And in India, different scholars have analyzed this process and articulated in terms of deindustrialization, primarily because of increasing import of machine-made goods from Britain and technological stagnation within the domestic economy. And this happened because, as you are all familiar with from your own history, the colonial policy was oriented towards naturally protecting their interests and extracting surplus from the colonies. And their concern was not so much about the welfare of the population, the colonies. Their primary concern was, maintaining law and order, tax collection, defense, and so forth. And the infrastructure that they have built, for example, in India, they have built up the railways, they have built up the telegraph, and these were essentially with a view to protect their own interest, the military movement, transport of, if you take the long-distance transportation network, this essentially to supply the imported goods to the hinterlands, and even the human capital, human infrastructure which was built up was essentially to cater to their colonial administration. And India was essentially reduced to a market for the manufactured goods of British industry. And, scholars like Dadabhai Nauroji as early as in 1860 and R.C. Dutt later had articulated the drain. They had the theory of drain of wealth theory, which, just like your unequal exchange from the, this part of the world, that explained India's backwardness. In fact, in a recent study, one of the scholars from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Utsa Patnaik, she has, in her recent book published by Columbia University Press, it was argued that during 200 years of British rule, almost $44 trillion was siphoned away from India to the British Empire. And today, British, UK's GDP is of the order of 3 trillion. And you know how much was and there are a lot of, in fact, I was sharing a story that when I was in Yale University, I came to know about the history of Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. It is in the name of Mr. Yale, who was the governor of Madras Presidency in India. And he amassed huge wealth, and that huge wealth was utilized to form the Yale Foundation. And it is based on that the Yale University was started, and the name Yale University, in fact, the original contribution came from India. Then. Anyway, so thus, by the time India got its political independence in 1947, India inherited a stagnant economy which has been growing at a rate of 1% during the 50 years from 1900 to 1950. And the per capita income would have been growing at something because of the higher population growth rate at the rate of 0.5%. And we had a situation, it had all the characteristics of a least or underdeveloped economy, in terms of very high illiteracy. 84% of the people were illiterate. And 60% of the children were never even attending the school. And the 85% of the people were agrarian, and agriculture was displaying all the characteristics of a backward agriculture. And we had a low saving and low investing economy. Of course, with the low income, your capability, the propensity to save was only of the order of 6%. And we had a lopsided industrial structure. Something like 47% of the industrial value added came from single commodity, that is textile, and 17% from jute. And there was hardly any base for capital goods production. So, you know that in 1934, Paul and Rosenstein Roden, to my mind, I would say that the development economics was perhaps inaugurated with the publication of Rosenstein Roden, wherein they underline, the need for, the balanced development, simultaneous investment. In 1938, 4 years after that, the National Planning Committee of the National Congress, the Congress Party which was leading the freedom struggle, they argued that the problems of poverty and unemployment and of national defense and economic regeneration in general cannot be solved without industrialization. So industrialization was upheld as perhaps the only means of transforming Indian economy. And the three fundamental requirements of India, if she is to develop industrially and otherwise, are a heavy engineering and machine-making industry. You need to have a capital goods base. Second, establishment of scientific research institutions and establishment of electric power. And these must be the foundations of all planning in India. The wisdom, what I'm saying that as when we have different economists articulating, development economists articulating, development driven by industrialization. So we have the thought process coming from the National Planning Committee, even, as early as in 1938. And in 1944, Bombay Plan for India, 3 years before India's independence, a plan for India prepared at the instance of India's leading capitalist private sector. They again articulated the need for industrialization. A people's plan articulated by Indian Federation of Labour both underlined the need of industrialization. And it was again emphasized that the Indian private capital is in a stage of infancy, and the kind of investment needed to promote an industry-based, a heavy industry-based development cannot be expected from the private sector, wherein the state must play an important role. The role of the state was very much established, was emphasized even by the private capital. At the same time, there was a kind of tension happening in India. We have the freedom movement led by Gandhi on the one hand, Gandhi's idea of village development, village Swaraj. The word basically means much more of a decentralized, small-scale industry-oriented development. On the other hand, we have Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a man of scientific, he is known for his scientific temper and heavy industry. So we had, on the one hand, the Gandhian school and the modernizing school, the conflict. And all these got resolved in what is called, in India's approach towards its industrialization. So India aimed at, by 1951, the first plan onwards, an import substituting growth, not an export-oriented growth, an import substituting growth, which is led by public sector, because public sector was expected to act as a model employer, and public sector only can have the capability to invest what is called the focus on capital goods. Public sector has to take the lead, while promoting small industries to ensure balanced regional development, because India is known as a country which is much, much more diverse than most continents. Even today, the number of language, number of dialects, and of course with the purpose of employment generation. And this has to be done not by the magic of market, but through an elaborate system of planning and regulation. So we have got various Industries Development Regulation Act coming in 1951. I don't want to elaborate on that. And we have by 15 years, this is one of the pioneering first article on India's industrial performance by none other than the founder of our institute, by Professor K. N. Raj, who himself drafted the first 5-year plan for the country. And you will find that 1947 to 51, the rate of growth of the country, the industrial growth was 4.8%. Then came the first 5-year plan, that is 51-56. The rate of growth was 7.4. And 56-61, second 5-year plan, 6.8. And 61-65, 8.9%. Remember, this is a remarkable performance for a country which has been growing at a rate of 1% from 1900 to, say, going by the 70 years rule. For India at that time, it was taking almost 70 years to double your GDP. So from that kind of a scenario, we are getting a kind of remarkable performance during the last 15 years. But then there came, after a period of mid-60s onwards, an industrial deceleration phase. Rate of growth plummeted to half. And this was actually much more articulated put by using index of industrial production. These figures shows that while the 10 years had a record rate of growth of 7.8%, it became half, almost half, during the next 10 years. Deepak Nair's article in 78. And this actually has led to a industrial stagnation debate in India, a lot of articulate academic debate on how to account for this deceleration after the remarkable performance. There were essentially two broad sets of argument. On the one hand, people were making the case for this declining stagnation was on account of lack of domestic demand, because we had a highly unequal society, and inequality was, and because unlike in South Korea, which went in for land reform and more equitable society before their industrialization strategy, India never went for land reform. And there was a case for more agriculture, creating more reforms in agriculture, because at the same time we had the studies by Amit Bhaduri and others coming up with an analytical framework to understand the backwardness of Indian agriculture by articulating the reality of Indian agriculture. The semi-feudal relationship, which is articulated in terms of the farmers are essentially, they are not the owners of the land. So normally they take land on rent. And when you take the land on rent, you have to, the output, you will get a part of that. You are a tenant. Tenant means you take the land on rent. Two things happen. The landlord has no interest in making permanent investment in the land. So land productivity is low. With the low level of productivity, the whole family works in the land. They are able to make basic minimum subsistence production. And for starting production, they borrow from the landlord. So you are able to barely pay the loan. So you have to go for next loan to next cultivation. And landlord is also the person who buy the product. So you have a situation of land market, credit market, product market getting interlinked. in a situation where this leads to a perpetual kind of a situation, inequality, a perpetual state of underdevelopment in the agrarian sector. So you have this kind of an agriculture sector. We need to have land reform, and that is one line of argument. Other line of argument was saying that India, and also India being a democracy, unlike say China or other countries, whenever you have a problem, the best solution is immediately appoint committees. So whenever there's a problem, there are committees. So since 76 article of Cambridge, we find Alexander Committee, Dudley Committee, so many committees coming into. And these committees on the one hand, and on the other hand, the studies, there are two types of argument. One is a supply side argument. On the other on the demand side argument. Other thing is more institutionally driven, policy driven argument saying that India's regulatory system, what is called the Anno Kruger and others, saying that our, by late 70s, we had enough literature from the Western world arguing that the import substituting regime was breeding its own inefficiencies. So you have nothing but you got to liberalize. So there comes the first dose of liberalization in the Indian economy in 1980s. The 80s liberalization was very different in terms of its form and content from the 90s liberalization. For the rest of the world, there is a general feeling that India opened up in India liberalized in 1990. No. India's liberalization, unlike in many other countries, was a gradualist process. In the 70s, we have internal liberalization. This internal liberalization involved, doing away with many of the internal restrictions. In fact, Danny Roderick and former economic advisor Ramesh Subramanian, they articulated that the liberalization of 80s essentially aimed at increasing efficiency. Capacity utilization was expected to be enhanced, and private sector was enabled to make more profit. So they articulated it as what is coming. There are a lot of the steps are taken here. So this is something like pro-business. 80s liberalization was pro-business, and as compared to the pro-market liberalization of 1990s. I would like to say that, it is something very interesting to say. During 80s, we were open. So, for example, we were open to FDIs. We were open to FDI, but only one FDI was allowed in automobile industry. Suzuki was allowed. Suzuki was permitted to enter the industry, and Suzuki joined. It was not a fully owned foreign subsidiary, but it was a joint venture. And Suzuki taught India how to make automobiles. And based on that 10 years experience, what actually happened, we had a very elaborate auto component industry got established. And this is exactly what happens in China. What is Suzuki for India was Volkswagen for China. And when in 1990s we opened up, everyone could come, no hardly any restrictions. What I would say is that internal liberalization phase, in fact, there's a period wherein I studied my PhD, it's a period of my PhD on electronics industry. And I argued that electronics industry, in fact, was much ahead of other industries in terms of policy reform. Most of the reforms initiated in electronics in the 1980s were exactly more or less the same, the one which was elaborated in 1990s. Electronics industry, in fact, is not an industry, but it is a broad sector. You have got electronic consumer goods, you have electronic capital goods, you have electronic intermediates, just like capital goods, intermediates, and consumer goods. And I have argued in 1980s, I argued that the kind of liberalization that we have done in electronics would lead to intense import competition and doing away with what is called domestic employment generation capacity. It will lead to dependent development. It will lead to, what I'm trying to argue that the kind of prediction that I made about the electronics industry, in fact, came true for the industry sector as a whole. In fact, that's what we see later. Anyway, the point which I want to argue is that in 1980s, industrial growth picked up. I told you that up to mid-60s, the growth rate was almost 7.8%. 65 to 75, the growth rate was half, 3.5%. And industrial growth picked up to almost 6 to 7%, 7% in 1980s. And 80s growth rate, of course, had its own problem. By end of 80s, we had the Gulf War. We had India's external sector got strained. And we had India's non-resident Indians who were the major source of foreign exchange to India remittance. They acted as non-reliable Indians. Non-resident Indian became non-reliable Indians. And there's severe outflow of money. And we had no other way but to go for IMF loan, naturally. IMF loan means you have to agree to Washington consensus. So 1991 liberalization comes in. So what is 1991 liberalization? 1991 liberalization broadly within the IMF, yesterday 10 commandments of IMF was elaborated by Professor Kunli. That got manifested in 1991. In fact, there are a lot of stories to this. I don't want to say that, in 1991, July 21st, when India's industrial policy was placed in the parliament, the industrial minister was actually a minister from my state. He was not in favor of these liberalization policies. In Congress party, at least at that time, many 3-4 leading leaders were from Kerala. Since they are from Kerala, Kerala is for instance, Kerala, for your information, Kerala is the first place in the history where a Marxist party came into power through democratic process in 1957. 57, left party came into power. After 5 years, right party came. After 5 years, left party came. After 5 years, right party came. Then now it is left party ruling. Next year we'll have election, right will be coming. So in fact, if you read our language, Malayalam, my language is actually Malayalam, Malayam. Malayalam. You can read from left to right and right to left. Malayalam. So Kerala, whether it is ruled by left or right, same in fact. And in fact, some of our right leaders from Kerala are much more leftist than the left. So much so that the industry minister, the industrial policy was actually drafted by Jairam Ramesh, who was, I'm very close to him. He was the key architect of that policy. And the policy was given to the minister to present in the parliament. He, instead of presenting what he did, I am placing the policy on the table of the house. He just placed it. He didn't present it. Because he was in principle against this industrial delicensing, complete foreign investment, foreign technology transfer free, and public sector disinvestment, and regulations on monopoly houses, MRTP monopolies and large industrial houses restrictions were done away with. And that is the kind of the first 1991 July policy. Then with 1995 WTO, India became one of the pioneer, one of the what is called India is always completely for multilateralism. So we are one of the founding members. In 1996, we again, being one of the founding members of Information Technology Agreement, and we signed Information Technology Agreement in 1996. Brazil did not sign. China, of course. South Africa did not. Russia did not. And after 15 years, after 15 years, WTO came with a document saying that 15 years of ITA, Information Technology Agreement. Information Technology Agreement essentially means that you have to do away with all the restrictions in the trade in IT goods. The whole underlying theoretical premise is that when you do away with the tariff restrictions, the price of IT goods will decline. When the price of IT goods will decline, the use of IT goods will increase, and without promoting IT use, you cannot harness the use of IT and promote prosperity, all those things. In fact, I have a study on that after 15 years. Interesting thing is, when within 15 years, India was chairing the Anwarul Huda, who was our representative. He was chairing the meeting of this session. India signed. Within 15 years, India's electronics industry went to nothing. Now India has no place in electronics. China waited and watched. They joined WTO in 2002. Their share in global trade of IT goods was 2% at that time. Today they account for 33%. India has gone to nothing. Now, along with that, we also got into number of regional trading agreements. And today, we are again forging ahead. We have got a new program with the new government like Make in India. We are trying to attract more FDI. And we are trying to promote startups. That is called Startup India. We are trying to promote skilling India. The whole idea is to aim at a manufacturing output of 25% of the GDP. That is the idea. Now, with this is the industrial policy. Now let me look at correspondingly how has India's S&D policy regime evolved. There are broadly two phases. The first phase, I would like to say that it's a pursuit of self-reliance under restrictive regime. In fact, India is one of the developing countries to recognize explicitly the role of science and technology. In 1974, we have the Sussex Manifesto calling for developing countries, saying that, look, at that time, the main debate was choice of technique. That Amartya Sen and others, as far as developing countries are concerned, technology is a question of choice. Either capital intensive or labor intensive. Your problem is only choice, right? Choose from the international technology itself. But there is, at that time, we have the literature coming in saying that developing countries' problem is not one of choice, but it's also a problem of development, developing technological capability. So we have, much before that, in 1958, we have the Science Policy Resolution, in which it was at the instance of India's first Prime Minister. The key to national prosperity, apart from the spirit of people, lies in modern age, in the effective combination of three factors: technology, raw material, and capital, of which the first is perhaps the most important. The role of technology was explicitly recognized as early as in 1958. Now, in the spirit of that, we have, you find a number of initiatives. In fact, I'll let run fast. In fact, my time is getting over. Yeah, we have elaborate human infrastructure. I mean, the infrastructure was built for building up what is called engineering colleges, the establishment of IITs, which became, major source of human capital for America, because, in 1968, there was a study saying that almost 73% of IIT graduates migrated to America. And there is a saying that as far as Indians are concerned, IITians are concerned, their one feet is in India, other feet is in Air India. Once the degree is over, they just go. And there is another counter argument saying that, okay, look, it is better. There's a lot of studies on brain drain. So they're saying that it is better to have brain drain rather than brain in the drain. So they, of course, we have software story. I'll come back to that later. So we have made elaborate arrangements at that time under the control regime for building up of a science and technology base. And there's a statement by Surendra Patel, by the UNCTAD Director General in 1993 in book. The maze of institutions for science and technology is an outstanding testimony to the widespread of scientific and technology infrastructure. India has no rival in the whole third world for the vastness of infrastructure, and even many among the highly developed countries could not be able to rival India in number and the spread of institutions. You have got regional research laboratories in all the states. to cater to the local needs. You have got IIMs, you have IITs. At that time, the kind of investment that India made in science and technology at that time, when a period when it was considered as a luxury for the developing world, it was something beyond what India could do. In fact, if you look at each plan by science and technology investment, you will find each plan it is, the annualized growth rate to 235%, 115%, the growth, enormously high growth rate in terms of investment. But let us not forget the fact that all this investment was basically at the instance of the state. Of course, as Professor Kunli said, private sector was too much in its infancy. They could not think of much investment, but much of the investment was in the public sector, Department of Atomic Energy, Defense Research and Development Organization, Department of Space, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, Indian Council of Agricultural Research, Indian Council of Medical Research, and others. These are the main agencies they accounted for almost bulk of the investment in research and development. Now, what is more important at that time, in 1970, India had, you are all must be familiar with, a unique patent act, which was Indian unique Indian patent act, wherein it did not permit product patent in food and chemicals, particularly pharmaceuticals, which in fact laid the foundation for the so-called reverse engineering and the process patent-based development of, and that in fact is the basic reason for India's build-up of capability in the sphere of pharmaceutical. Because in fact today, auto and pharma are the two important areas where India has built up significant capabilities. Now, then we have technology policy statement. In fact, I was saying yesterday, there are a number of initiatives essentially towards addressing specific problems like even literacy, drinking water, telecom. What I'm trying to say that is a period wherein there were a number of initiatives towards building domestic technological capability. Okay, all under basically driven by the state in the science and technology capability building. And if you look at the expenses, R&D intensity as a proportion of GDP during 1973 to 85 period, our GDP, it increased by 0.04%, and that change was almost comparable with many of the countries. Of course, our R&D intensity was not, it was almost less than 1%, but the change which was noted in 0.04% to actually change was 0.05%. So this was almost in sync with the change which was recorded in other countries. So what I'm trying to say that the R&D expenditure front, India was comparable with other countries. Now, we have 1990s. We are now moving towards globally integrated innovation for international competitiveness. So 1990s, there has been a paradigm shift in science, technology, and innovation involving harnessing all possible external sources for stimulating domestic capability building for fostering an internationally competitive economy. That is the declared objective. Earlier it was an inward substituting, basically internally driven. Now it is trying to. So what you find here is foreign direct investment got encouraged, and you have got you have got Indian companies increasingly investing abroad with India's huge scientific manpower availability. We have India emerging as a major location for R&D outsourcing. So India got embedded in the global innovation network. So this is a kind of a paradigm shift from what we have seen from the earlier period. And along with that, your R&D GDP ratio, you have today, it is 0.69%. This curve shows the R&D GDP ratio. It has steadily declined. Earlier we have seen, earlier period was increasing Now it is declining. Then comes R&D expenditure is by and large, of course, central government. The share of central government declined. Private sector, of course, increased, now 38%. And but when you look at the R&D expenditure, this is the private sector. They hardly spent just 1%, 1.5% R&D intensity of private sector. And this is the high-tech industries. There, of course, their R&D intensity is high. On average, this curve shows it is just hovering around 1.5%. And number of patents, you find that in terms of number of patents registered, it is there's of course there's an increase during this period. Then there's a steady decline. What is more important to show is that the number of Indian share in the patent registered. This curve shows the Indian share that steadily declines. Now, what is the outcome? Now, let us put this together. What is the kind of outcome that we see? Okay. This is a graph taken from the former economic advisor Kaushik Basu. This period, I have some quarrel with him, but it's okay. The first 50 period, he wanted to, and this. So we find that he observes following stages. The first 75, more or less same. That's not correct, actually. In fact, first mid-60s up to 60s, there's an increase. Then it's a decline. There's a decline. Then 70s growth rate was higher, and 90s still higher, and 2000 still higher. And last few years, there's a declining trend. This is the GDP growth rate. Of course, there is hardly any symptoms of this is the per capita GDP in US dollar. So from the point of view of our discussion, India's GDP, per capita GDP is just about $2,000. It is not anywhere in the middle income. And there is, notwithstanding, there's a fluctuation, but the trend is increasing. We are yet to, it will take another 10 years at least to catch the attention of US. So there's no that kind of a trap. And now what is happening? Coming to the sectoral distribution of GDP, we find that the share of service sector today accounts for almost 60% of the GDP. And agriculture, the share has declined. Today it is accounting for almost 15%. Quite natural to expect. And here it shows industry, including gas and water, manufacturing, put together, it is almost 25%. If you look at what actually happened is that why we aimed at manufacturing, we gained in services. We'll come to the software story a bit later. So we have this manufacturing, the share of services from 38% in 1970, today it is almost 58%. Whereas manufacturing, in 1951, the share of manufacturing was almost 9%. From there, it increased to almost 15, 1980, 16%, 1980. This growth, this percentage vary across different numbers. But what the point is that from 90 onwards, notwithstanding all these initiatives, we have got so many committees, so many commissions appointed, so many reports came, but so many reforms, but the share of manufacturing remains almost stagnant. This is what we are concerned about, and this is what government is concerned about. This is what government is working for, to get making 25% of India's GDP. And what is the implication of this? For that, you have to look at the employment in different sectors. We have got something like the share of employment. We know that 50, this is agriculture, employment in agriculture. We have almost 44% of the employment in agriculture, and they produce what? 15% of the GDP. That means, on the other hand, if you go to services, we have something like 58% of the output produced by some 33% of the employment. So you have got, and in manufacturing accounts for almost 16% of the GDP. They account for something like 13% of employment. So what is that? Manufacturing, you have what is called the productivity gap is much less. But on the other hand, agriculture, you have a very low productive agriculture and very high productive services. The basic ingredient of inequality in the economy. So much so that we find that the inequality in the country has been increasing in terms of industry, the inter-regional development, which is what we have been trying for equal development across the regions. Inequality in terms of sigma convergence, it has been increasing. Then we have, if you measure by beta convergence, you find that in low-tech industries there is a convergence, but in high-tech industries it is diverging. And this divergence cannot be de-linked with FDI, because if you look at the FDI, we have got 30 plus 50, 56, 62% of total FDI under the market-driven policy going to 4 states. So no wonder the regional industrial growth became much more lopsided. And as Piketty and others argue, this is the top 1% of the GDP, the top 1% of the income share, it is increased. And if you take bottom 50%, it is steadily declining. So inequality has become a major concern in India too, whereas up to 1980s, we were successful in terms of bringing down inequality. So, let me get to the question of deindustrialization. It is not that deindustrialization which I am saying for the first time. And the term deindustrialization, you are aware, saying that, it is essentially refers to a decline in the manufacturing sector's share in gross domestic product or decrease in the percentage of employment contributed by the sector. Premature deindustrialization occurs when the share of industry in employment or value added declines at a lower levels, at a lower per capita income. Now, if you look at the world over, these 3 curves shows for the 3 time points. Blue dots shows for 1988, green shows for 2000, and red shows for 2010. So what we find is that we have an inverted U-shaped curve. So in 1988, the peak share of manufacturing was 30.5% at a per capita GDP level of 21,000. And by 2010, the peak share of manufacturing was 21%, and the per capita income that was attained at the level of 12,000. So your agriculture, industrial GDP is declining at a lower levels of per capita income. So that means that, and that essentially means that the so-called advantages that the earlier economies had to achieve prosperity through industrialization is no more available for the countries that are going to, the emerging countries. So in case of India, this is, we shows that this is the share of, the same figures. The employment figures are here. This is the output figure. It is declining. And what is more important here, India being a large country, you have got some states much bigger than, for example, Uttar Pradesh, their population may be as much as Brazil. So if you take different countries, this table shows the year in which peak manufacturing share was achieved. For Tamil Nadu, one of the most industrialized states, the share was achieved at 2010. And after that, it has been declining. And at that time, their per capita GDP was just $4,000. At $4,000, their per capita GDP peaked, manufacturing GDP peaked. And at that per capita income, their registered manufacturing employment, not unregistered, they have 2 sets of manufacturing units. One is registered units, they employ more than 10 people. Others are unregistered. The share was, peak employment share was 6.2%. So if you add unorganized as well, it might be maximum 14% or 15%. So you have a situation, and if you take other states, say for example Uttar Pradesh, so that reached at a per capita income of $800 and the manufacturing employment 1.6%. So the key challenge here is, and you talk about employment, and what has been the nature and character of employment which was generated? It was more of more of low quality employment. We are talking about the quantity of employment. What is more important from the development perspective is the quality of employment. If you look at the quality of employment, if you look at the share of contract workers, that has increased from 14% to 34%. The people on contract, that means they are not permanent, they have no access to provident fund, no pension, no gratuity. These are all fire and hire, hire and fire kind of. So now the question is, what causes a deindustrialization? Of course, country, we have different sets of argument. One, Daniel Rodrigo was talking about globalization, and Cassius for 19, FDI role has been highlighted, and in India, one of the earlier studies, no inquiry has been taken up. To my mind, first of all, for a large country like this, inquiry has to be done at the regional level. And it has to be done at the industry level. So we are actually, we are not really done that. We have done, what we are doing is some groundwork for that. So what is more important here is that even today the argument is inappropriate specialization of the argument is that, in India, what is actually happening is that we have, if you look at the character of India's industrialization, it was more high-tech industry. India is an industry, India is a country having its comparative advantage in low-skilled labor. And low-skilled labor, comparative advantage country, working for or focusing on high-tech industry. This mismatch is one argument which has been given in the literature. Now, to my mind, I would like to kind of put it in a kind of how to explain this process, because we have to see it in a long-term perspective. So to my mind, I would like to argue that when you're talking about industrial development, we have to talk in terms of capability building. That technological capability, the innovation capability or the capability building, essentially it is a technological learning capability we are talking about. And that learning can be and be thought in terms of an interactive process, that interactive learning process. That learning can come from, on the one hand, an experience-based learning. You can also think in terms of science-based learning. And according to the innovation system perspective, learning is a socially embedded process. It is a cumulative process. It is an interactive process. And that interaction can be thought in terms of, for example, intra-firm interaction. Within a firm, the marketing department interacting with the human resource development department, within a firm. You can think in terms of intra-country interaction. Actors within the country interact among each other. Science and technology working with the universities, with the science labs, with the competitors, with suppliers. You can think in terms of inter-country interaction in the science, in the STI mode. That will be in the form of technology licensing. It can be in the form of alliances, whatever it is. Now we have got experience-based learning. This can be again thought in terms of intra-firm, inter-country, intra-country, and that we can get represented in terms of import and export. One can think in terms of managerial training, workers' training, and all kinds of things. So now let us look at, say, for example, in India, how we have been harnessing this interactive learning phase. Let us take, say, for example, this is a period wherein we have seen by 1990 an opportunity, a unique opportunity never ever heard in the history of developing countries. In India, a third world country emerging as an IT superpower. This actually provides opportunity for interactive learning for Indian firms. Because, yesterday we are talking about the apps development, the Indian, and software is nothing that nobody consumes. It is actually something which enables the user to become more productive, competitive, and efficient. So if there is more interaction among the firms, within IT firms and other firms, it can be an instrument of building your international competitiveness, your efficiency. So what has been India's approach in that? I don't want to cut the long story short. Here, you find this table. In 1990s, you find a sector growing at almost 50% growth rate. Look at this record growth rate, 1990, 49%. Annual growth rate in export was 49%. And it declined later, 38%. These are growth rates that never ever heard in Indian history. And production growth rate again, similarly. How it was used? It was used essentially as a means of earning foreign exchange. It basically came as a year 2000 problem in 1990. 1990 was a period where India was under severe foreign exchange crisis. And at that time, this came as an opportunity. It was used as a foreign exchange earner. And in that process, okay, what we find here, that same economy, same industry is now growth, the 2016-17, the growth rate has become negative. I'm not going to conclude anything. Next, what happened? As a result of this, what happened to hardware? Because software and hardware are two sides of the same coin. We have hardware industry declining. You have what is called output growth you have the trade balance in electronics. Oh my God! Today it is projected to be almost 400 million in the next 2025. It is going to be the highest import item of India, electronics imports. And import intensity is increasing. And of course, export intensity is very negligible. And domestic availability ratio is declining. Now coming to, let us go to China. Same China, we have got, say for example, total electronics export of 430 million. 430 million, 30 billion worth of software export of electronics export, while India's total export this year is 313 million. So China's electronics export is more than almost 1.5 times India's total exports. And they have got huge surplus on electronics. And when you are coming to software, if you look at China's software, they have a total domestic production of 200 and, total is 285. I have not updated it. Out of 285, 255 is domestically consumed. And export at that time was only 10. Now it is actually 40 billion they are exporting this year. On the other hand, India has a total production of 150 billion, out of which 100 billion is exported. Domestic consumption is hardly 50 billion. So what I am trying to argue that when China used the software capability for promoting interactive learning within the economy, which in turn made other sectors productive, competitive, and efficient, which in turn enabled them to flood the world market with the output, which in turn enabled them today to have a total foreign exchange of more than what? 3,000 trillion? That is China's foreign exchange reserve. On the other hand, India, what happened? India, I'm coming here. This is a simple resource movement effect. India used this capability to export foreign exchange. In that process, make the international firms, American economy, particularly 70% of export goes to America, American economy more efficient, productive, and competitive. In an open economy, when your firms are working for other countries' firms to become internationally competitive, you are in fact working against your own economy. In that process, we give 30% income tax concessions. So, in a sense, there may not be any county in the US which is working very hard, as hard, to make American economy more competitive and efficient, like Bangalore in Kerala, in India. So, what I'm trying to say is that in that process, this graph, I'm trying to use the typical resource movement effect in the Dutch disease syndrome. For example, we have a situation wherein one booming sector emerging in software. this booming sector is able to provide, on account of exogenous demand, wages much above other sectors can afford to offer. Software wages in Kerala was always higher than other sectors. That naturally drives in, attracts manpower from all the sectors. If you go to campus selection, IT man goes, Infosys, Wipro, and TCS, they go and offer 30, 40,000 rupees. And IT guy has got a better market in the matrimonial market. And he gets every 3 months foreign travel. It's the most attractive job. So the best guys, not only from electronics, mechanical engineering, civil engineering, chemical engineering, all disciplines, best guys goes to software. And what do they do is different job altogether. This is another story. And when the other manufacturing sector, when they go for campus selection, they won't be able to get the best guy because they cannot afford to pay the same salary because they don't have a world market of the type. This is the world wage which they face here. This world wage is world wage for software is much higher than for the software wage. So what I'm trying to say that this resource movement effect adversely affecting the manufacturing. So what I'm trying to say that using that interactive learning mode, you can articulate that this software opportunity that could have been used as an interactive mode, which we have not used on account of that. You can articulate in two conventional ways. In the traditional conventional ways, you can use the Dutch disease economics, or one can look in our interactive learning mode. Now, in the GVC, how are we integrating ourselves? Are we integrating at, there is an interesting statement by Joseph Stiglitz about globalization, 2001 book. He says that globalization is neither good nor bad. For those countries which globalized at their own pace and at their own terms, it has given enormous rewards. But for others, it has been an unmitigated disaster. So now the key question is, are we integrating with integrity? Are we integrating at our terms and at our pace? That essentially means that, are we integrating with the competence building? Because we have seen that STI mode of learning, through R&D, through patenting, it has declined. DUI mode of learning in the form of FDI, import, that has increased. Now, we find that India's export, compared to China, this shows the share of export in India's GDP. Of course, China was China naturally, their export GDP ratio was much higher. Now, of course, it is comparable. Now, the point which is, if you look at what is important, the share of India and China in global trade, India has not even able to cross 2%. This is the big difference. And this crossing 2% needs your competence building. That competence building comes through STI mode of learning. That competence comes through DOI mode of learning, through harnessing hardware, software, and other IT capabilities. Now, of course, I should not forget the fact that the trend is, this is the global, this shows the growth rate in India, China, and the global, moves in the global pattern. Now, when you are talking, in this globally integrated world, our share of value added has been steadily declining. And within that, you find this is the input-output table. We estimated that imported components, imported inputs intensity, that has been steadily increasing. Of course, last 3 years, these are something which needs further exploration. And the share of high technology and low technology imports. India's share in high technology is increasing, low technology is declining. This high technology, when we are talking about, it is not the high technology. Okay, let me go to the next. And when you talk about this high technology, there is one line of argument saying that India has got low-skilled manpower and you should be producing low-tech commodities. But going by Korean experience, we are telling that, Joseph Stiglitz says that going by the conventional World Bank advice in 1970s, South Korea should have specialized in the production of basmati rice, because they were the best rice producers in the world. That is where they had the comparative advantage. But if they remained focused on that kind of advice, static comparative advantage kind of advice, they would have remained as good rice producers now. India, of course, there are some indications showing that India is moving away from low-tech to high-tech. But the point which we need to know that within low-tech, within high-tech, look at the quality index. India's quality index is nowhere. This is India's quality index. This quality index cannot come from heaven. It has to come through your internal technological capability. And again, where are we, this low quality index, where are we selling? India's export direction. We are not exporting to Western markets. We are not selling to high income markets. We are exporting mostly to Africa. So your high-tech products, we are auto exporters. Our auto exporting is where? Our export to Western market is 1%. And less 99% is the other countries. And that has its implications on interactive learning of the type India is getting. Now, as a result of that, what we find here is, you look at the unit value index. If you look at the different items, there is the trend growth in quantum index is pretty high. We are surviving on quantity, not on unit value index. You are able to achieve high price provided you are able to have premium quality, you are able to differentiate your product. So what I'm trying to argue is that there is some, one could argue that during the journey, India's overall journey, the 80s, up to 80s, we were trying to focus more on STI mode of learning. That STI mode of learning was more in the intra-country, not inter-country, closed economy mode. As we moved to the globalization mode, the learning dynamism got changed. It is more of DOI mode of learning, STI taking a backseat. And it is not intra-country, it is more inter-country. So what actually is needed, and in fact we have a recent study in which I'll just conclude, I'm sorry. Okay, even when I say about this poor performance of manufacturing, a recent study using Clem's database has shown that India's total factor productivity growth is higher than even China. And that is a study by a team from India and China. They have came up with this result. And we were looking for how to explain this. India's conventional literature will argue in terms of R&D. India's R&D is 0.69 and China's 2.1. Technology import, according to World Bank survey, something like 19% of the Chinese firms import technology. India, it is 8%. Chinese number of patents registered is 1.8 million, almost 2 million. India's is 45,000. So none of these conventional indicators are able to explain India's productivity turnaround. So we have kind of articulated using this STI DOI mode of thing. Then we found that the managerial expertise, the labor training, these are important factors. But these are not factors which come into our STI policy at all. So what I'm trying to argue that if we believe that building economic transformation is quintessentially a process of competence building, capability building, and from capability to competence, just like from invention to innovation. And that is essentially a process of learning process. Learning capability at the level of individuals and organizations. And that interactive learning space has to recognize both STI, experience-based, and science-based. Science-based learning and experience-based learning. Doing, using, interacting, and science, technology, innovation. These are the two. And if you are trying to and here lies in understanding the local reality and articulating your policies and institutions according to that. That will give the rewards rather than trying to kind of, going by somebody else's consensus. And somebody else's consensus can be your disaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Joseph. It's 11:20, so we'll have a 10 to 15 minutes non-coffee break. There's no coffee outside, but there's water and there's a cafeteria in case. And we'll be back around 11:35 then. Okay. Thank you for the Marcelo's comments and then open to the audience. Thank you very much. Okay, back in business. So we'll listen to Marcelo Pinho's comments, and then after that we'll open for the audience.
Thank you, Roberto. First of all, I'd like to thank CEDAPLA and Professor Eduardo for inviting me for being here. This is UFMG is a place where I feel very, very comfortable. It's, in academic terms, I would say my second house. I feel more comfortable here than at, I'm sorry to say, at Unicamp, Renato, when I studied. But it's really a nice place to be. It's true. Well, as much as Renato and Jorge, I have to face the challenge of commenting the presentations here. And in my case, an impressive presentation from KJ, and a broad one. And it's more challenging because KJ took very seriously the mission Eduardo is attributed to him, and went even further, I believe, reaching theoretical reasoning. Especially the model of types and levels of learning he presented to us is one of those things that represent many difficult process, with stunning and enlightening simplicity. For the comments, one possible way of trying to face the challenge would be searching for both similarities between the Indian and Brazilian experience. There are lots of similarities, 90s liberalization, mostly evolution of technological efforts, but also large difference. Most of all, our recent macroeconomic and industrial performance. Our deindustrialization, KJ, is much, much stronger than yours. And another way of proceeding would be focusing on the very, very appealing argument on the contrast between Chinese and Indian evolutions in some of the key activities in the current techno-economic paradigm. But I will not do any of those things. It's impossible. It's to be a challenge to improvise. So I will stress 2 points. The first is about 1 point directly from the conclusions from me of KJ's presentation. India may not have experienced a tale of development as impressive as that of Korea or China, but for Brazilian economists, and I believe many of my colleagues will agree with me, for Brazilian economists, India's situation and India's prospects seem now, after the KJ presentation, much brighter than I thought they were. And that's good news for us. As a natural resource gifted country as we are, in the last decade, the 2000s, we took a ride on Chinese development. not the growth we experienced in that decade was not bright, but considering the level of economic growth in Brazil in the last 4 years, it was the best decade in almost half a century. So it's not entirely unlikely that we can take another ride in the next decade now on Indian development, and thus would at least alleviate our stagnation. The second point is a little longer, and I will raise some comments about the discussion we have begun yesterday with Glenda's presentation. Here in Brazil, as I said, for the last 4 years, beyond instability, we had very slow economic growth and mostly a regression in productive and industrial structure. It's a very poor macroeconomic performance. We frequently forget the problems of the previous 40 or 50 years of high growth. We used to call that period from 1930s to the end of 1970s, and economic historians still use the term, this excluding development phase. The forgetting nowadays is certainly misleading, but it's kind of justifiable. In the 35 years after the World War II, Brazilian economy grew by more than 7% a year. 7.4% a year, more precisely, from 1944, the very beginning of national accountants in Brazil, up to 1980. In the following 4 decades, the growth was no more than 2.2%. And in per capita terms, no more than 0.7%. That is, at this rate of per capita GDP growth, it will take more than a century, precisely 105 years, for the Brazilian per capita GDP to duplicate. So in such a situation, it's, I believe, justifiable to have our concerns so focused on growth. Such a poor macroeconomic performance induces that. Yet, during the times of high growth, Brazilian society faced many problems, and probably the worst of them was the incapacity of the economy to include the large and increasing number of poor people in the country. Even at its heights, manufacturing has never been the leading sector in terms of employment, even less than in India. In terms of employment, although we did have, no doubt of that, an industrialization. But most Brazilian workers struggled at traditional occupations, at rural areas, or at precarious employment, both at formal and informal sectors. I still remember a time at the late 70s where unemployment was considered not the main problem on public debate in Brazil, but rather underemployment, what we call subemprego. So for me, it's with satisfaction that Glenda yesterday and KG2 bring us the subject of inclusive development and inclusive strategies for catching up. In Brazil, it means that if, and this is quite a hard condition to meet, if Brazil overcomes the middle income trap, we most probably would have to deal again with the problem of excluding development, and probably in more difficult terms, since growth everywhere, India, for instance, but everywhere in the world, becomes less employment intensive and less inclusive. I will not take the risk of saying what we must do in this contest. Fortunately, I can ask for the help of Glenda and try to repeat what she said yesterday in one of her answers to, I don't remember, but who has asked, but if I'm not wrong, Glenda stated that in order to overcome the dramatic figures of unemployment and exclusion, South Africa should seek for upgrading coalitions and a more inclusive growth, as well as carrying out good industrial policies for fostering both employment-intensive industry and the development of new and dynamic activities. I would add just that we also need social reform, lowering working hours and enlarging social protection, although in our time, this is not easy to do. There is a lot of constraints on these issues. To end my comments, I would like to just elaborate a little more about why this last leg of promoting new and dynamic industry is needed too. There are some reasons, but I will stress just one: balance of payments constraint. This has been a major problem for Brazil and many developing countries. KJ also told us that the liberalization in India in the 90s was some kind of result of a problem like that. But it was a problem for Brazil and many other developing countries throughout the 20th century. Because we had in 215 and 216 our first long depression, and a very deep depression, recession at least, that was not primarily caused by balance of payments problems, and because also of the huge accumulation of international reserves, this issue was put out of the spotlights in Brazil. This does not mean, however, that this constraint cannot come back. I think it is indeed very likely to arise from strategies that focus only on domestic markets. So sustainable development strategies should not forget this threat. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, now we will open to the floor, to the audience. Gustav, let's get a round of 3 maybe, if we have 3. Luda? Okay, we have three then. We'll begin with Gustavo.
Good morning. Thank you, KJ, for your talk. Thank you, Marcelo, for your comments. Of course, all these topics are very dear to my own research agenda. I have two questions for KJ. I have many questions for Marcelo, but I can talk to him later on. One specifically about inclusive development, and the other one about the role of services, in which I think India and Brazil are in very different positions. The question about services then first. Have been working with international input-output matrices, and it looks like a big part of deindustrialization is due to basically activities moving out of manufacturing. So there is this very strong relationship between these two sectors, especially manufacturing industry purchasing advanced services. And that's fine. It looks like countries that grew more are those in which the service sector grew exactly connected to the manufacturing sector, which is not the case for developing countries. Most developing countries, especially Brazil, in which our late friend Rodrigo would say that services grew in bakeries, hairdressers, and what's the other one? Motorcycle shops, which are, it's fine, no prejudice with these sectors, but in terms of innovation and the drive these sectors have for growth are not very very big, which is not the case in India. India has very advanced service activities. So what do I have to say in terms of the possibilities of leapfrogging from within the services sector and not from manufacturing to the services? I think this is a huge possibility, especially considering the very large numbers coming from I don't know, engineering and related sectors activities in India. That's the first one. The second one is it's shorter, but maybe the answer is not possible in this time. I find that, of course, things people we study have been studying for a long time, have been talking about inclusive development for a long time. The connection between this and sectoral trends and technological trends, is, of course, are part of our agenda. But my concern in this day and age is what does it mean for the common people? Maybe it was a lot easier in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s to make this connection between way of life changes for the common people, for people coming out of poverty, coming out of rural areas, and it would be maybe easier to see what would be the promises of this new life. This is not the case, at least for Brazil, at this point. People are pretty much satisfied with revenge. That's good enough for most people. And they get revenge on voting, they get revenge on Twitter, they get a lot of revenge on Facebook and WhatsApp. But this promise of development never comes. Like, it's very important, it's very real, the need for research and to say that development must come with inclusion. But in terms of what this really means to people, I think we have been failing in providing this answer. Maybe these answers are different in India. Numbers are also huge. Whatever we think about Brazil, we have to think 5-6 times as much for India. What do you think about this? What are the changes when you talk about technology, technological change? What does it mean to families and households? And yeah, thank you.
Who is now?
Okay.
So, congratulations, KJ. An excellent presentation. Congratulations, Marcelo, for the comments. 2 questions, 2 different subjects. First, back to the historical context. I think it's, yesterday you mentioned something very important for India, castes. So I would like to listen you about, as far as I know, it's something before the British arrived there, and so the caste system changes. But it was forbidden in the constitution, your first constitution after independence, and but it seems that it has a role in India, and so I would like to listen about especially the relationship between the caste system, its change, and current inequality. So that's and ask if this could be a blocking factor for an obstacle for further development and so on. First, the second is just to as Gustavo said, India is too large. Some states in India have the size of Brazil. So could you give us a short idea about this difference, inter-states difference in industry, manufacturing, service, general idea of how languages and how this is important for you? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you all for your presentations. I have two questions for KJ. First, what is the role of China in the Indian deindustrialization? And second, how India is dealing with this trade war initiated by Donald Trump, responded by China, how India is dealing with it.
I think I will start with the last question that I remember very well. Others have noted. And, we are, when we give answers, always remember that my job is to raise questions. And raising question is very important. Rather than giving answers, I start with a story again. The founder of, you must have heard about Economic and Political Weekly, one journal from India, EPW, no? That's one of the most widely read journal from India, Economic and Political Weekly. Its founder was a student of the Delhi School of Economics. So his teacher is the person who founded our institute, and he was the Delhi University Vice Chancellor. This particular editor of the journal, the second editor, not the first founding editor, second editor, he was very good in the class, raising wonderful questions like this, always. So Dr. Raj, the founder of our institute, used to say that when this particular boy is in the class, I should be very careful because he raised very interesting questions. But when the exam comes, his marks never exceed 45%.
We all know that.
So he came to Professor Raj, the founder of our institution, and said, look, sir, I'm very worried about my future. So his name is Krishna Raj, Krishna. He told Krishna, unfortunately, the system of evaluation is against you. If the evaluation were to raise questions, you would have got maybe 80-90%. But unfortunately, you all give answers. But you don't answer. You only raise questions. So similarly, raising question is very important. I have no this thing that I will give answers, and I will try. And all what I try, you take with a pinch, maybe a spoon of salt, not a pinch of salt. To complete the story of that guy, the founder of this journal wanted a person to work for the journal. So he told, okay, why don't you go to Mumbai and work for it? After 1 year, the founder of the journal asked the Dr. Raj, my professor, can you send me one more person like this? So he was very good. So he immediately wrote an email, no email at that time, one letter. Please request his mother. So anyway, so now the question is very important. Now, what is the role of China in Indian development? In fact, China is today the greatest trading partner of India. And India's trade deficit with China is India exports something like 10 billion, and we import something like 80 billion. So we have a 70 billion trade deficit with China. And Chinese, that this import, quite a lot of Chinese imports are actually adversely affecting Indian industries. Many of the small-scale industries are getting killed because of that. But unfortunately, we being a WTO member, we cannot do anything much. There are some anti-dumping moves are being raised against. Some cases are remaining. But on India's deindustrialization, China has her hand there. That's a fact. Now, in fact, the recent talk in the Indian industry policy parlance is that, okay, now, I often used to say in India to our policymakers that if we are clever, our current account deficit of 70 billion could be compensated with 100 billion investment from China in capital account. But unfortunately, we won't allow much investment from China because of strategic reasons. In port, we won't allow. In telecom, we won't allow. We don't like their mobile. We have a lot of problems. So China will take away our information. So we, unfortunately, if it's not being recorded, I would have said, there are some other, the thing is that, in fact, our own minister, one of the ministers went to Tianjin and said in China that, he was economic advisor at that time, he said that India is unnecessarily erecting investment barriers to China. And when he came back, he was working for his boss was very unhappy with him, but he had to patch it up. The fact I'm trying to say that India-China trade and investment relations could be improved much to India's benefit. In fact, I hold a position in China, 2 months I spent in China. Wherever I used to say that, when you are talking about 21st century, in a Gunnar medal, yesterday I was saying that in 1968 books found that Asian drama is going to be a tragedy, but it turned out to be a big comedy, very unexpected story, where in China and Korea they have played an important role. And in fact, China and India should be able to articulate a new political economic power for the new millennium, because the tragedy of the previous millennium was that the two superpowers were in fighting. Can China and India think in terms of a new thing wherein two superpowers, anyway, whether we like it or not, in another 20 years' time, India's fate, India will be different, I'm very sure, because if BRICS other predictions going up, India will be going up, and China also is. So we should be working to a better political economy relations, which could be creating a new world. That's what one should be working for. And the current topic is that because of the restrictions of Trump on China, there are new opportunities coming to India, which Indian policymakers are actually very much looking forward to that. In fact, it might. And also there is what is called, because of the rising cost of wage in China, India is having investment opportunities from China itself, which Indian policy is not imaginative enough at present to attract it. And we have got huge investment opportunities. In fact, I must say that I have taken a Chinese ambassador to our finance minister and chief minister. And they had a meeting, they had an idea about electric buses. We have a public transport corporation, which is in huge, bad deficit. And one possibility is if you can invest in just like leapfrogging, next generation buses, electric buses, that could be one possible way where China was willing to give loan for that. But our state is left government, but central government will not permit that. Anyway, I don't know whether these are correct to say it. Okay, okay. Now, that is coming to India, China. I think Gustavo, your question is, it is rather difficult to answer, because what I articulated today is, by being within the conventional paradigm that until today the economic history teaches us that no country in the world has never ever exceeded the per capita income level of, say, 2,000, 3,000 without industrialization. And with primary agriculture, nobody has succeeded. But now the question is that with Industry 4, and other technological options, what is the new paradigm of development? Is it how far Nicholas Calder's 3 laws will be operating in the years to come? This is something which I have not answered. You are actually asking that question. I think this is actually a very interesting area of inquiry. I think I kind of articulated the whole problem with the belief that industry is key to development. That need not necessarily be so. Need not necessarily be, because there might be possibilities, but that analytical foundations of that is yet to be evolved, to be best of my knowledge. I think that is actually, if I can give a good answer, perhaps next year I can be in Stockholm for Nobel Prize. But unfortunately, I don't have a good. It's a very relevant question, in fact. Second question which you asked about is about when you articulate inclusiveness. I think today sustainability and inclusion are the 2 most fashionable terms which we all like. When you talk about inclusion, when you are talking about inclusive development, and if you believe that development comes out of the innovation system, if you want your development to be inclusive, the underlying innovation system has to be inclusive. So now here comes, we need to really explore the systems, if you like it, in terms of what is called this learning and interactive spaces, in terms of intra-form, intra-country, that kind of interact. What are the kind of spaces of exclusion comes up? That is where perhaps any realistic inquiry towards inclusive development should start from there. And that leads to your question about caste system. When you are talking about, say, for example, when you believe that development or capability building is nothing but learning and interaction, and ideas often, just like what Adam Smith said, innovations are not always brought by the man who always thinks, also on the shop floor also they are bringing in. Because he talked about the boy who was with the pushing thing all the time and he found a way of getting out of that. So there are a lot of ideas coming from the people from the shop floor. From that shop floor person, that idea has to get translated to a saleable idea or economic benefit out of that. It has to reach the R&D man, the thinker of Adam Smith. But unfortunately, if you have a situation of like caste system existing, of course, class everywhere, if you find that the man in the lower caste is in the shop floor, he has an idea, and there are caste restrictions in terms of moving that idea for free mobility of ideas from lower class, higher position, other that can affect your learning process. So in India, I would say that it is, even if it is significantly vary across states. Some of the rural areas in India are really in bad shape. The state which I belong to is not the state. In fact, one of my students from Chhattisgarh, one of the backward states, recently came to me and said, we took her to a village recently. He told, sir, that is not village. There's no problem there. These are urban areas. Our village is in very bad shape. Because the thing is that the caste system of the type which we used to see 100 years ago, 50 years ago is not there. But even then, exclusion of the type that we see in the rural settings in India is not a very pleasant one. I think we need much more improvement over there. So I think when you are talking, that also leads to the question of what is called the interstate variation in the levels of development in India. We have human development indicators across different states. We have got inclusive development achievement across different states. We find that there is significant interstate variation. So we have, incidentally, in India, southern states apparently, Kerala, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, they are. In fact, I would say that Tamil Nadu is one of the states, our neighbor, is the one which is catching up very fast. And India, I mean, in terms of human development indicators, as Amartya Sen said, shown across Kerala's development model, even with the low levels of per capita income, we have got human development indicators comparable even to developed world. And that is supposedly a model which, I remember in 1984 article of Amartya Sen Development, which were now in Economic Journal, he compared China, Sri Lanka, and Kerala. And he was trying to argue that, you don't need to have very high development. Today India is trying to have doubling our GDP by 2024-25. We don't, I'm not against doubling GDP. You need to have a walking up 2 lakh strategy in terms of while you double, you also try to see that the public actions are enabling the less privileged to get access to education, access to health, basic facilities. So the distribution aspect, there is an overemphasis on cake creation. We are always, Indian policymakers were often used to blame that Indian policymakers are always concerned about distributing cake without making the cake. So let us make the cake, then we will distribute. So now we have been making cake, now cake is pretty big. But now we are still making the cake bigger. So I would say that in terms of interstate development, the beta coefficient which we have shown, there is significant divergence. In terms of interstate variation is widening under globalization. And that is something which, an area of there are a lot of studies, in fact, on that area is going on. Okay, I think I partly attempted all the 6 questions, I suppose.
Marcel,
No, not at all.
I'm going to take advantage of my privileged position here to pose a question before I open back, because I couldn't. I'll give some information for some people in general, which is I want him to talk more about Kerala, the state where he comes from. Kerala is a very small state, smaller than Rio de Janeiro, a little bigger than Alagoas. It sits in the extreme southwest of India. It has 30 million people, 33 million people, so it's 3 times the average density of India. It's been governed, like he said, by the Communist Party and a rightist party since 1957. And its highest levels of IDH, human development, HDI, and levels of literacy above 95%. It's the question that's interesting for me, which is urban-rural relations, are very dense.
This is urban.
Urban, the whole state. No major industries, no international capital. So it is a peculiar model of development. And so I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on that in the relation to this, the question of innovation and how does it affect and what. I know they have problems of unemployment, they have problems, other problems. It's not a paradise at all, but that's where the Center for Development Studies is. So it's got this particular. So after that, I open to the floor again. There's Rashi.
Yeah, I have a question related to the discussion about industrialization, not only at the intersector perspective, but also at the level of enterprise, interfirm perspective, because India you have one of the most diversified enterprise in the developing countries. That's that Tata Group. I would like to listen some comments about how this process affects the decisions and how these decisions can be, well, affected by industrial policies or not in the case of India. Consider specifically the case of Tata Group. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. Ladies first.
Yeah. My name is Ana Luisa. Thank you, Professor Joseph, for your talk. I would like to make a comment, maybe too specific, because I studied in my PhD higher access to higher education and inequality, and I studied the case of India. I was at JNU for some time at the center, Zakir Hussain Center for Higher Education. And one thing that caught my attention is that India went through a different path than Brazil in the last few years regarding access to higher education. Because if you, on one hand, here in Brazil, we increased democratization, or we increased equality in access to higher education. In India, that was the opposite case. I think the batteries.
Yeah.
So for the case of Brazil, we had an increase in equality, or a decrease in inequality in access to higher education. And for the case of India, many studies showed that although India had a large expansion in higher education, so you now have 27 million students in higher education, those that profited more from this expansion were the Hindus, the men, the higher income families, and families from states where the higher human development index was already higher. And that I took some notes here. And then in 1997, the percentage of students in higher education that were receiving free education were 13%. In 2007, it was 5%. So you decrease the amount of students having access to higher education. So maybe if you could comment on this, because we always talk about how education could help us reach inclusiveness and reach development, but we also have to look the other way around, and the role of the private sector as well in accessing to higher education.
Once more.
There are three.
Okay.
Three, yes.
Okay.
I think, I go by what Chair said, which is again convenience, ladies first. And the JNU, Zakir Hussain Center. How long did you spend time there?
I was just for a month.
Okay, 1 month you learned so much. You're a fast learner. I have not learned. I was in JNU for 3 years on deputation as professor. I have learned so much. Good. Okay. I think you are actually hitting at the bullseye of the Indian development today. In fact, if you look at India's education policy, right from the beginning, we were very much convinced about the fact that the public returns to investment in primary education is high, whereas private returns to investment in higher education, that is high. So government was always, Indian policy was essentially for primary education, lower level, school level education. Later, we at the same time we had a kind of what is called islands of excellence, IITs and kind of stuff, which here and there. There, the access was, of course, limited because it is rather easy to get admission in Harvard than in IIT, any of the IITs in India. Now, the IITs, it has been expanded. In fact, 11th plan came into end in 2012. And 12th plan, then Prime Minister was very much for addressing the problem of higher education, expansion, equity, excellence, his three slogans. So almost 100% investment allocation was envisaged in the original plan, but ultimately didn't happen. So at the same time, what we did was we opened up, along with the globalization, privatization thing, we gave private education open to private sector. Higher education open to private sector. So much so that today, the leading JNU is no more. I mean, I don't. There are leading private sector universities which are established at the instance of private companies which made money from IT and software. For example, Asim Premji, Shivanadar HCL Computer. Shivanadar University is a very good university. Then you have got Asim Premji University in Bangalore, where you went. And we have got Ashoka University. I mean, there are so many good private universities are coming up. So much so that what actually today, the recent studies, one of my own students recently has submitted a piece about a piece on higher education investment in India. Her finding is that the exclusion to higher education to the less privileged backward communities and backward caste has actually increased. So the point here is that even with this, India's higher education enrollment ratio today may be not more than 22%. Whereas OECD is 55%, if I remember correctly, I think. So India needs a huge higher education, highly educated people. At the same time, this increasing privatization and cut, today there is the current, I don't know what is the current budget, but there's a major argument for increased public investment in higher education. That's not happening. So in that context, what actually we are happening is that we are having a major deficit in higher education. All the more important here is that we are a great country and we don't have any, we have got Tsinghua, Zhejiang, all the universities have got hype. They are 70, 60 rank in the global university ranking. And we don't have, our highest rank maybe 150. I mean, IITs, industrial science, it used to be around 200. So what I'm saying that the quality of higher education needs much more improvement in India. And at the same time, access needs this thing. And the private entry has not really solved the problem of unaffordability. Private institutions are basically meant for profit. And the state has not. Theoretically speaking, when private investment is coming, the state can provide access to those who are not afford to pay. But that has not really happened. Even today, there are severe, access deficits in higher education in India. That your observation is correct. So this is a major challenge for India. We need much more highly educated people, much more higher quality educated people. In fact, industry, academy, in fact, fact of the case is that industry complains that though you have got 27,700,000 engineers are coming out of the universities, they are not at all employable. Here there is a problematic in terms of industry wants readily, usable people, but university is not capable of doing that. Not capable. The question is that you need to have a judicious mix between industry-university interaction. And what is the form of that? And as of now, industry-university interaction in India is very minimal. In fact, we had done a survey of IT firms as part of our own study 8 years ago. Only 10% of the companies are interacting with the universities. Even in a high-tech area, more knowledge-driven area like IT, then what about other sectors? So this is an area where we need to do more research or more doing is needed. Okay, I don't know whether I have partly at least addressed your problem. Second thing is coming about Kerala model is a long story. Kerala model of development is actually, it's not a model of Kerala's development experience, better to put it like that. And that experience, that unique developmental experience came out of a host of factors. There are historical roots to that. Even while the time in Kerala state was formed in 1956. Even by the time India became independent in 1947. Kerala was head and shoulders other states in terms of education. Thanks to the Christian missionaries. So Kerala has a population of almost now 22, it used to be 24%, now it is 20% Christians and 20% Muslims and rest 60% Hindus. But interestingly enough, I must praise, I have all appreciation for Hindus from Kerala. You have got, it's a long story. The communal harmony of the type that prevails in Kerala, there are many temples where you can go to temple only after visiting the mosque. And we have got many Christian churches where Hindu lamps are used. So in fact, there's a story saying that, okay, in Kerala, Christians are the ones who are converted. St. Thomas, apparently, the story says that St. Thomas came to Kerala in AD 52. And he converted 7 families. Who are the 7 families? 7 Brahmin families. So Brahmin are the high caste. So if you trace all our family history, we all trace our history to that Brahmin family. So that means all the Christians are Brahmins. So we all trace to Brahmins. But the fact of the case is that there is a lot of communal harmony, and Hindus of Kerala needs to be appreciated simply because today we are having a major communal divide in the country, Hindus and non-Hindus. Out of the 540 seats, 20 seats are from Kerala. Though we had, the BJP government had a huge victory, not even a single seat from Kerala. Though we had 60% Hindus. We could have had all 20, you could have sent Hindu candidates. Not even a single Hindu party candidate or BJP candidate got success from Kerala. That is uniqueness of Kerala, I must say. So now to put so Kerala has a very particular development pattern wherein we have got high human development indicators in terms of health, education, literacy, almost 95%. And women, the infant mortality rate is something like 9% for the country, maybe some 45%. And women marriage at age, much higher than this thing. So, because thanks to education. But theoretically speaking, all these high human development indicators should ideally get translated in high productivity. It should naturally, human development indicators should get high productivity in Kerala. But unfortunately, what we have been seeing is that our commodity producing sectors have been stagnating. And so much so that we are as economy today surviving mostly on remittances. Almost 40% of the state remittance account for almost 40%, as much 40% of the Kerala's GDP. But to cut the long story short, Kerala's development dynamics is one wherein our productive sectors of the economy has been stagnating from mid-70s onwards. We have a paper with one of my friends, Harilal. We argued that remittance induced Dutch disease in Kerala. In fact, what actually happened was mid-70s, a lot of people migrated to Gulf. Who migrated are basically carpenters, masons, and because of the Gulf construction. So when those people migrated, the wage level of such workers in Kerala increased. Okay? Because labor being mobile factor. So when construction workers' wage went up, agriculture wage went up, industry wage went up, and a state like Kerala, which almost 90%, 80% of our output is sold outside. What we produce is spices, cashew, coir. These are all exported outside. So those industries became non-competitive because of the high-cost economy. Kerala, ideally, being a high literate, high wage economy, can survive not on traditional products because Kerala's manufacturing sector was almost 72% of the employment and 72% of the value added was coming from traditional industries. So you have a mismatch, highly skilled people, high wage economy, and you are having low skilled product. And we had to have a structural transformation of the industrial output of the Kerala, which never happened. And because we are also having highly militant, labor militancy was there. A lot of problems were there in the 70s. So we have a paper, we argued that this remittance-induced Dutch disease was adversely affecting our productive sectors of the economy. So in mid-90s, Kerala started a new experiment in terms of decentralized development, wherein 35% of the total budget expenses goes down to the panchayat level, local level. So there they decide how much money to spend. And we have got another interesting experiment in terms of Kudumba Sri. Kudumba means family. Sri means what? Welfare. We have a women-led movement. You can go to Google and find it out. Some 44 million women are engaged in this activity, below poverty line women. They are engaged right from electronics assembly to catering in metros. So they do a lot of. So these are some of the state-initiated moves. So Kerala has certain uniqueness in terms of achieving the unique development pattern. But then there are obvious limits to Kerala model of development. Almost 70 to 80% of the total budget revenue expense is going for pension because there is nobody in Kerala who doesn't have a pension. Right? Anyone you pick up, they have some pension or other. It's a welfare state. So almost 70 to 80% of the money is going through what is called pension and salary. So government has no money to invest in the reproductive activities. So the finance minister has now come with a new or KIFBI. I mean, there is another organization has been formed that raises funds from global world markets. So last month he was in London. He's raising money from the London Stock Exchange and for investing in infrastructure. I mean, Kerala is doing a lot of innovation like that, governance innovation. So it has got a lot of problem but then so far it is doing well. And we have got interesting idea of these migrants who went up in the 70s. Today they are coming back with ideas and objects. We have the migrants establishing big education institutions. They are establishing big hospitals. Big hospitals are all now private hospitals. And the state is also, with that, state has now, last year they started a education, what is called health insurance for all. There are certain, Kerala has certain interesting things to say. I don't know where, just my answer was very unplanned, certain. Now, Orge, you are talking about the Tata group. Tata is actually, the interesting thing is, yesterday I was time and again coming back to the point which Kunli raised. See, large is also beautiful. We were told that small is beautiful. He was saying that large is also beautiful. So you have to promote large. Largeness today has certain advantages. Tata is actually a company, you know that Air India was actually a Tata-owned company. Indian Institute of Science, this is Tata's enterprise. Tata started Indian Institute of Science. And in fact, Tata Data Library in Delhi University. And Tata's group's contribution towards India's intellectual and other pursuit is incredible. But having said this, has there been any systematic efforts by the state to promote Tata? I don't think that it is there. And if it is there, it won't be politically acceptable in India. And this is a typical case where Tata came with a major experiment of nano car, small car with what the cost was 1 lakh rupees at that time. It is 1 lakh is $3,000, $2,500 something. That turned out to be a major flop for different reasons. But Tata had, I mean, I'll tell you my personal incident. Bought my car from Suzuki, the small car. Then I went to mid-level car. That at that time Tata came with their car, so I was in JNU at that time. My JNU professor told us, he also bought a Tata car. Let us promote Tata. It is a good car. We bought a car. It was bought in 2011. But in 2012, I want to buy another car, slightly bigger one. Tata didn't have a car. Then the question is if there is a proactive state. And by the time Hyundai came with many different models, Toyota came with, and all the companies were operating. But Tata delayed. Tata's next version came only last year. And why that happened? When Duster came with this model, everybody emulated, that model Duster, that SUV of, yeah, that is it. So what I'm trying to say that, SUV. Sumo. Yeah, as a big car.
Yeah, if everybody understands that.
Yeah, the point I'm trying to say is that Tata is a very, it's a conglomerate operating everywhere. But unfortunately, the fact of the case is that Tata has bought Chorus, largest deal with 5 billion major investors made. But fact of the case, I'm trying to say that the way in which Cooley argued, there is no systematic way in India as of now to promote large enterprises. Until 1990, we were against monopolies, large companies. From 1990 onwards, we are indifferent. Until then, we used to control them, don't grow. Monopoly, restrictive trade practices. That means in the healthcare, you should be You should be preventive. You should prevent disease. But in monopoly, you should be curative. But rather, in monopoly, we were preventive. Even before they are acting, we were trying to curate. We were trying to prevent. Monopolies and restrict preventive practice. So, since 1990, we became a little bit more neutral. But a proactive policy of the type which Cooley was articulating is yet to emerge. But the point is that in a developing country context, with political connivance and other things, rent-seeking behavior, how do you do it in a manner such that public money doesn't go to private profiteering? That's a big question. Because I don't know, it is where, how Korea was able to manage with something which one could actually learn. We need to learn more. So Tata, I think, it's a very, very successful case in India, I think. But even in software, I think the role of the private sector's role is not really articulated. In fact, I often used to say that we have got major IT companies like Infosys, TCS, Wipro. Even today, leading IT companies in India are not foreign firms, are Indian local companies. Somehow we are able to manage that. But in pharmaceutical, some of the large companies like the Ranbaxy was taken over by Daiichi and others, but at least in IT. But then state is not, I would say that state should be playing an appropriate role in terms of bringing together the capabilities of these three companies for addressing our rural problem, addressing the plantation economy problem, primary commodity market. We are not having that. That kind of a guidance. Because state is leaving things to market. I think there is a general belief that it is the magic of market or because of the benign state neglect that IT has done. That is a wrong approach. I think state has to do a more proactive role. And in this kind of context, what is the form and content of such state interventions which will be profitable to society and society at large and sustainable development? And that is a key question which we have to kind of think further, I think. Thank you. I think I talked too much.
Marcel.
No, I have the last question. Can I do it?
5
minutes. Yeah, 3 minutes. Because as usual, I always make a question for the discussant. I did it for Renato, for George. Now it's time for Marcelo. About the lessons that he learned from KJ to think about the Brazilian case. So, which were them? That's your turn.
I think I advanced the one of them in my comments. I was very skeptical about the possibility of Brazil engage in the kind of growth we have in the first decade of the century, taking a ride in the Chinese development, the Chinese growth. I'm not so skeptical now. If India keeps growing, I don't know if we, for better and for worse, have the possibility of engage in the same kind of arrangement we had with China, we are having with China, but now with less dynamism than 10 years ago. That the one I have elaborated on. Others will, I believe, will arise afterwards. So I have just one not question, but I would like to ask KJ for a suggestion. I believe many of us are interested in one good synthesis of Indian economic history, modern Indian economic history, one reference to that for us to read about.
Modern economic history. There are a lot of, modern means post-independence.
Post-independence.
Post-independence, a lot of work.
So that's the problem. That a lot. The problem is that that's a lot.
I think I will send you an article. There is I recently think Kaushik Basu's article is I liked it. It's a recent article on Indian Kaushik Basu. You go to wider discussion paper. Wider World Development Wider World Institute of Development Economic Research. They had a conference on Asia after 50 years of Asian drama. 50 years of Asian drama, in which he has an volume is going to come up, edited by Deepak Nair, and in which there's an article by Kaushik Basu. I like that article. It's guessing one article you can get there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Kaushik Basu is writing. There's there is book-wise our former economic Niti Aayog chairman. What is his name? I'll give you that title. His book is very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I think Kaushik Basu is a friend of Campolina. He's written, been together, writing some stuff together. Okay, shall we? So thank you very much, Professor Joseph and Marcelo Pinho, for his comments. It's been a very interesting session. I'm particularly interested in it. But so we'll be back at 3 o'clock after lunch. Okay? Thank you very much. That was very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I hope we'll be meeting again in India.
Yeah.
I hope.
I actually want to ask you a few things because I thought of